David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 26, I Fall into Captivity. Days and weeks slipped away. I was articled to Spenlow and Jorkins. I had £90 a year, exclusive of my home rent and sundry collateral matters from my aunt. My rooms were engaged for 12 months certain, and though I still found them dreary of an evening, and the evenings long, I could settle down into a state of equable low spirits and resign myself to coffee. At about this time, too, I made 3 discoveries. First, that Mrs. Krupp was a martyr to a curious disorder called the spasms, which was generally accompanied with inflammation of the nose, and required to be constantly treated with peppermint. Secondly, that something peculiar in the temperature of my pantry made the brandy bottles burst. Thirdly, that I was alone in the world, and much given to record the circumstance in fragments of English versification. On the day when I was articled, Mr. Spenlow remarked that he should have been happy to have seen me at his house in Norwood to celebrate our becoming connected, but for his domestic arrangements being in some disorder on account of the expected return of his daughter from finishing her education at Paris. But he intimated that when she came home he should hope to have the pleasure of entertaining me. I knew that he was a widower with 1 daughter, and expressed my acknowledgments. Mr. Spenlow was as good as his word. In a week or 2 he referred to this engagement, and said that if I would do for him the favor to come down next Saturday and stay till Monday, he would be extremely happy. Of course, I said I would do him the favor, and he was to drive me down in his phaeton and bring me back. When the day arrived, my very carpet bag was an object of verification to the stipendiary clerks, to whom the house at Norwood was a sacred mystery. One of them informed me that he had heard that Mr. Spenlow ate entirely off plate and china, and another hinted at champagne being constantly on draft, after the usual custom of table beer. The old clerk with the wig, whose name was Mr. Tiffy, had been down on business several times in the course of his career, and had on each occasion penetrated to the breakfast parlor. He described it as an apartment of the most sumptuous nature. The phaeton was a heavy, handsome affair. The horses arched their necks and lifted up their legs, as if they knew they belonged to Doctors' Commons. There was a good deal of competition in the Commons on all points of display, and it turned out some very choice equipages then, though I always have considered, and always shall consider, that in my time the great article of competition there was starch, which I think was worn among the proctors to as great an extent as it is in the nature of men to bear. We were very pleasant going down, and Mr. Spenlow gave me some hints in reference to my profession. He said it would be the genteelest profession in the world, and must on no account be confounded with the profession of a solicitor, being quite another sort of thing, infinitely more exclusive, less mechanical, and more profitable. We took things much more easily in the Commons than they could be taken anywhere else, he observed, and that sets us, as a privileged class, apart. There was a lovely garden to Mr. Spenlow's house, and though that was not the best time of the year for seeing a garden, it was so beautifully kept that I was quite enchanted. There was a charming lawn, there were clusters of trees, and there were perspective walks that I could just distinguish in the dark, arched over with trellis work on which shrubs and flowers grew in the growing season. We went into the house, which was cheerfully lighted up, and into a hall where all sorts of hats, caps, greatcoats, plaids, gloves, whips, and walking sticks. "Where is Miss Dora?" said Mr. Spenlow to the servant. Dora, I thought, what a beautiful name. We turned into a room near at hand, and I heard a voice say, "Mr. Copperfield, my daughter Dora, and my daughter Dora's confidential friend." It was, no doubt, Mr. Spenlow's voice, but I didn't know it, and I didn't care whose it was. All was over in a moment. I had fulfilled my destiny. I was a captive and a slave. I loved Dora Spenlow to distraction. She was more than human to me. She was a fairy, a sylph, I don't know what she was. Anything that no one ever saw and everything that everybody ever wanted. I was swallowed up in an abyss of love in an instant. There was no pausing on the brink, no looking down or looking back. I was gone headlong before I had sense to say a word to her. I, observed a well-remembered voice, when I bowed and murmured something, have seen Mr. Copperfield before. The speaker was not Dora. No, the confidential friend, Miss Murdstone. I don't think I was much astonished. To the best of my judgment, no capacity of astonishment was left in me. There was nothing worth mentioning in the material world but Dora Spenlow to be astonished about. I said, "How do you do, Miss Murdstone? I hope you are well." She answered, "Very well." I said, "How is Mr. Murdstone?" She replied, "My brother is robust. I am obliged to you." Mr. Spenlow, who I suppose had been surprised to see us recognize each other, then put in his word. "I am glad to find," he said, "Copperfield, that you and Miss Murdstone are already acquainted." "Mr. Copperfield and myself," said Miss Murdstone, with severe composure, "are connections. We were once slightly acquainted. It was in his childish days. Circumstances have separated us since. I should not have known him." I replied that I should have known her anywhere. "Miss Murdstone has had the goodness," said Mr. Spenlow to me, "to accept the office, if I may so describe it, of my daughter Dora's confidential friend. My daughter Dora, having unhappily no mother, Miss Murdstone is obliging enough to become her companion and protector." A bell rang, which Mr. Spenlow said was the first dinner bell, and so carried me off to dress. The idea of dressing oneself, or doing anything in the way of action in that state of love, was a little too ridiculous. I could only sit down before my fire, biting the key of my carpet-bag, and think of the captivating, girlish, bright-eyed, lovely Dora. What a form she had, what a face she had, and what a graceful, variable, enchanting manner. I made a mere scramble of my dressing instead of the careful operation I could have wished under the circumstances, and went downstairs. I don't remember who was there except Dora. I have not the least idea of what we had for dinner, besides Dora. My impression is that I dined off Dora entirely, and sent away a half-dozen plates untouched. I sat next to her, I talked to her. She had the most delightful little voice, the gayest little laugh, the pleasantest and most fascinating little ways that ever led a youth into hopeless slavery. She was rather diminutive altogether. So much more the precious, I thought. When she went out of the room with Miss Murdstone, no other ladies were of the party. I fell into a reverie, only disturbed by the cruel apprehension that Miss Murdstone would disparage me to her. But when we went into the drawing-room, I was relieved of them in an unexpected manner. "David Copperfield," said Miss Murdstone, beckoning me aside into a window, "a word." I confronted Miss Murdstone alone. "David Copperfield," said Miss Murdstone, "I need not enlarge upon family circumstances. They are not a tempting subject." "Far from it, ma'am," I returned. Miss Murdstone shut her eyes, inclined her head, and then slowly opening her eyes resumed. "David Copperfield, I shall not attempt to disguise the fact that I formed an unfavorable opinion of you in your childhood. It may have been a mistaken one, or you may have ceased to justify it. That is not the question between us now. I belong to a family remarkable, I believe, for some firmness, and I am not the creature of circumstance or change. I may have my opinion of you, you may have your opinion of me." I inclined my head in my turn. "But it is not necessarily," said Mrs. Murdstone, "that these opinions should come into collision here, as the chances of life have brought us together again, and may bring us together on other occasions. I would say, let us meet here as distant acquaintances. It is quite unnecessary that either of us should make the other the subject of remark. Do you approve of this?" "Miss Murdstone," I returned, "I think you and Mr. Murdstone used me very cruelly, and treated my mother with great unkindness, and I shall always think so as long as I live, but I quite agree in what you propose." Miss Murdstone shut her eyes again and bent her head. Then, just touching the back of my hand with the tips of her cold, stiff fingers, she walked away. All I know for the rest of the evening is that I heard the Empress of my heart sing enchanted ballads in the French language, generally to the effect that, whatever was the matter, we ought always to dance tra-la-la, ta-ra-la, ta-ra-la, accompanying herself on the glorified instrument resembling a guitar, that I was lost in blissful delirium, that I retired to bed in a most maudlin state of mind, and got up in a crisis of feeble infatuation. It was a fine morning, and early, and I thought I would go and take a stroll down one of those wire-arched walks and indulge my passion by dwelling on her image. On my way through the hall, I encountered her. I encountered her little dog, who was called Jip, short for Gypsy. I approached him tenderly, for I loved even him, but he showed his whole set of teeth, got under a chair, expressly to snarl, and wouldn't hear of the least familiarity. I had not been walking long when I turned a corner and met her. A tingle ran from head to foot as my recollections. I tingle again from head to foot as my recollection turns that corner and my pen shakes in my hand. "You are out early, Miss Spenlow," said I. "It's so stupid at home," she replied, "and Miss Murdstone is so absurd. She talks such nonsense about its being necessary for the day to be aired before I come out." "Aired," she laughed here in the most melodious manner. "On a Sunday morning when I don't practice, I must do something. I told Papa last night I must come out. Besides, it's the brightest time of the whole day, don't you think so?" I hazarded a bold flight and said, not without stammering, that it was very bright to me then, though it had been very dark to me a minute before. "Do you mean a compliment," said Dora, "or that the weather has really changed?" I stammered worse than before, in replying that I meant no compliment, but the plain truth, though I was not aware of any change having taken place in the weather. I was in a state of my own feelings, I added bashfully, to clench the explanation. I never saw such curls. How could I? For there never were such curls as those she shook out to hide her blushes. As to the straw hair and the blue ribbon, which was on top of the curls, if I could only have hung it up in my room in Buckingham Street, what a priceless possession it would have been. The little dog came running ahead to walk to our relief. He was mortally jealous of me and persisted in barking at me. She took him up in her arms. Oh, my goodness, she caressed him. But he insisted upon barking still. He wouldn't let me touch him when I tried. "You are not very intimate with Mrs. Murdstone, are you?" said Dora. "My pet." The last two words were to the dog. Oh, if they had only been to me. "No," I replied, "not at all so." "She is a tiresome creature," said Dora, pouting. "I can't think what Papa can have been about when he chose such a vexatious thing to be my companion. Who wants a protector? I am sure I don't want a protector. Jip can protect me a great deal better than Miss Murdstone. Can't you, Jip, dear?" He only winked lazily when she kissed his ball of a head. "Papa calls her my confidential friend, but I am sure she is no such thing, is she, Jip? We are not going to confide in such cross people, Jip and I. We mean to bestow our confidence where we like, and to find our own friends instead of having them found for us. Don't we, Jip?" And we will pause there.